Greetings from Stanford University. I'm Bill Barnett, professor at the Stanford Doerr School of Environmental Sustainability and the Stanford Graduate School of Business.
Hi, I'm Milian. I'm a sophomore studying Earth Systems here.
And we have with us today in the studio Professor Olav Sorenson, the Joseph Jacobs Chair in Entrepreneurial Studies at the University of California, Los Angeles. And now we just ran, Olaf and I, a conference here at Stanford on environmental entrepreneurship. And Milian, you were there. What was your reaction to the conference?
Yes, I think it was really awesome. Thank you so much, Olaf, for your introduction onto entrepreneurship and also like local businesses. That was really inspiring. And just hearing everyone talk about things from sustainable buildings to voting policies, it was all really amazing.
Well, thanks for that. I mean, now that we have a chance, we've got Olav here. Milian, do you have any questions for Olav?
Yes, I do. Actually, at the very beginning, you were talking about how local businesses, usually stay local. And I think often in the context of sustainability, we talk about how local businesses help, maintain communities and are like hubs for communities. I was wondering how, if you could expand on talking about the hometown advantage you mentioned, and also how local businesses can help to tackle local problems and how like supporting those local businesses are good for communities and economies.
Sure. My name's Olav Sorenson. I co-organized the conference. It was a pleasure. In the keynote that I started with, I talked mostly about how entrepreneurs tend to have this sort of home advantage, in large part because most entrepreneurs don't have a lot of financial resources, and so they're forced to essentially trade their reputation, trade their friendships, their trust for the types of resources they need, whether they're financial, employees, suppliers, connections to customers. And most of those connections are local. So it's a lot easier for entrepreneurs to get started, to be successful when they start businesses in their own places. Something that I didn't talk about, but I think is interesting in this context, thinking about sustainability, is local entrepreneurs also, because they're members of the community, as well as owners of the business, I think oftentimes approach their businesses differently from what we might think about as a foreign owner or somebody sort of external to the community, because they care not just about doing well for themselves, but oftentimes how their business is affecting the community as well. Is it providing good jobs? Is it, offering high quality services in a way that you might not get with, sort of a non-local entrepreneur?
Well, that's very interesting. A lot of your work, Olav, talks about just in general, not only about environmental entrepreneurship, but talks about the geographic nature of entrepreneurship. And here in Silicon Valley, people will talk about things as if they were about the Silicon Valley, but you seem to go deeper than that. What is the link between place and entrepreneur?
Yeah, I mean, I think that as I mentioned, a lot of these kind of networks in terms of being able to get access to resources are based on local connections. It goes further than that. I mean, one of the reasons that I think that we see a lot of clustering in industries is that in order to be a successful entrepreneur in an industry, you usually need to have some prior experience in an industry. And where you can get that experience? Well, usually working for one of the existing firms. And that means that entrepreneurs are sort of constrained. It's hard for them to start a business in a place that, they haven't been before. If they've been working for one of the other incumbents in the industry, they tend to, start their business in the same place. I think one of the interesting challenges that poses for environmental entrepreneurship is that sometimes it's a little bit different from like an accounting firm or a software company that can be located in anywhere. A lot of times these environmental entrepreneurs need to be located sort of near some type of physical problem, and so there could be a little bit of almost like a spatial mismatch between kind of where people can get the prior industry experience that they need to tackle the problem and where the problems actually exist. And that's, I think, an interesting challenge that we haven't really investigated that deeply.
So yes, I had another question about belief traps. I think was covered with the lecture by Sarah and Dror. Just they were often talking about how if you're running a business and you think this is what your consumer wants and that's what you're going to do, or in some cases, when talking about solar, for example, we're saying that if your neighbor gets a solar panel, you're more likely to get a solar panel. And in terms of like businesses and what types of environmental uh, like things that you're going to incorporate into how you're running it, either what you're selling or how you're supporting your services. I was wondering how we can shift the belief trap from, less sustainable options to more environmentally friendly options that are also better for the or for the business.
No, I'll just chime in that was the paper given by Professor Dror Etzion at University of Vermont, who came to the conference, as well as Professor Sarah Constantino, who's from the Stanford Doerr School of Sustainability.
Yeah. I thought that was a really interesting paper. I do think it's a challenge. People oftentimes are taking information about sort of what they should be doing, what's acceptable behavior based on, watching others, right? And, so how can you get things started, right, to kind of change behavior? I mean, their experiment was largely in actually almost providing factual information in a way that would, help people to understand that that their points of view were not unusual. In fact, they were in the minority, and then were more willing to act on them. It's also interesting to think about cases where maybe the behavior is not so common. How could you get it started? And there could be some interesting things around framing, right? Changing the way that you're framing what the population being reported is, right? So instead of thinking about, everyone in a community, maybe you say like among this set of people, this behavior is common, so that you can show that there is a community in which, there's a strong belief in whether it's recycling or, solar power or, whatever type of behavior you're trying to encourage.
Yeah.
All right, Bill, maybe I could cue you up. You started us off talking a little bit about hype behind the environmental entrepreneurship. And, we sort of saw that also at the near the end of the conference when Jeff York was talking about ocean energy. I wonder if you could expand a little bit on, what the theme was there and, if you saw sort of some commonalities between your perspective and Jeff's.
Oh, absolutely. Thanks for that, Olaf. Well, Jeff did a very interesting study on uh, the ocean energy. This is like you'd think about wind power, but you can also use the currents in the ocean to generate power. And this was all the rage in a number of parts of the world, Jeff reported, in especially in the United Kingdom. For a period of time, the excitement was off the charts, and then of course folks end up, if the material reality of the industry doesn't catch on as fast as the excitement, then there's a lot of disappointment. And as of all people, you would know, Olav, that folks in the entrepreneurship world like to talk about this as the hype cycle. So at first there's a huge amount of applause for something that can't live up to that level of interest, and then a downturn afterwards. And so it was interesting to see it exemplified there. I had a paper as well on this. This paper was with Natasha Overmeyer, who's a professor of business and entrepreneurship at the University of Oregon, along with Jason Chen, who's a student here at Stanford. And the three of us have been looking at hype and the hype cycle in entrepreneurship as well. And, folks know that just a couple of years ago here in the United States, the Biden administration passes the Inflation Reduction Act, which was a huge set of laws and other kinds of regulatory changes in favor of bringing on a more sustainable economy. And within a couple of years now, right now, we're not hearing the buzz as so positive, right? In fact, now you have companies, instead of greenwashing, something that was in another one of the papers, it's another form of hype where firms pretend to be green, even when they're not. That's what you would think of as greenwashing. And in fact, we had a great paper by Tom Lyon of the University of Michigan, who looked at that in a theoretical model of how incumbents, the conditions under which existing companies in an industry, think of them as incumbents, will greenwash under certain circumstances to keep environmental entrepreneurs out. And that had some fascinating implications. And so that's another form of hype. So what Natasha Overmeyer, Jason Chen, and I did is we looked at the hype cycle from 1960 to the present, looking at press. We did a large language model study of news articles over that 64-year period or 66-year period to look at sentiment analysis. So when were the highs and when were the lows, and how they differed between the political left and the political right. And as you can imagine, the political left was typically more bullish than the political right over the years about sustainability. But the political right often had times where they were very pro-environmental. Going back, for example, to 1970, when the Nixon administration signed the Clean Air Act as an example of that, and that was reflected in positive sentiments towards sustainability among conservatives at that time. The all-time low, according to this analysis, our analysis was 1980, and it was just matched this year. So yet just a couple of years ago during the Biden administration, of course, it was at a high. So there's been an up and down, a hype cycle around sustainability. So what we looked at was, well, what are the implications of that hype for the quality of the startup that gets created at a given point in time? The idea being that if the hype is too high, it's easier to get support for an environmental entrepreneur, which means that lower quality entrepreneurs can enter the market. And this is an idea not applied to sustainability and environmental entrepreneurship, but Olav, it was studied in our study way back in 2003, where we found this to be the case. It was actually better to be created during a period where hype was on the downswing than when it's on the upswing, right? Because during those times, harder to start a business, but the business does better as a result if it does get created. And we found that among Israeli entrepreneurs who are creating sustainability startups. So, it has this implication that while those who advocate for sustainability often feel bad when the hype cycle goes against them, if you stay the course, despite the low in the hype cycle, it can actually improve the quality of your entrepreneurial venture.
It's actually interesting, it kind of, the hype then almost runs in the opposite direction from the greenwashing type of hype, because there, when the incumbents are greenwashing, it's raising the barriers to entry and presumably, in some sense, leading to better entrepreneurship.
Yeah, no, that's a good point, actually. That's pretty interesting. Olav, there were several other papers in the conference, and I was curious, which findings really came to your mind as some of the most provocative?
Yeah, I mean, I Rita Katila, who's one of your colleagues in MSME at Stanford, I thought, she had this field experiment, which I thought was pretty interesting because, it starts to raise some questions about, how we can actually encourage investments if, the having a sort of sustainable angle or having a social return, could actually be perceived as negative in and of itself, in some sense, even if the expected financial returns are similar.
Yeah, that was super interesting. I was also struck by the blended finance paper by Professor Carolyn Flammer from Columbia University. What was your reaction to that paper?
But I thought that one's really interesting. I mean, she's basically trying to think about, well, how can you solve a type of market failure? So it's a really, well kind of tied in some ways with the, Rita Cotilla paper. And, I think what was interesting there is thinking about, very targeted interventions that the government could do, to try to make some of these, kind of social investments more attractive financially, and therefore, create a larger supply of finance for them.
Yeah, that's going to be very important as we go forward in this century, I think. There were a couple of papers on the connection between government and environmental entrepreneurship. When you think of environmental entrepreneurship, I think it's easy to think of it as if it was all free market, but obviously government plays a big role. Professor Chris Ray at Brown University talked about state capacity over a long period of time. And Professor Ed Walker, your colleague at UCLA in political science there, talked about the connection between environmental entrepreneurship and these interesting state policies that go in and limit sustainability. What did you think of that paper?
I thought that was really interesting, not just from a sustainability perspective, but even from, kind of thinking more broadly about, some of the housing issues in California and other places. I feel like construction as an industry, as, kind of part of sort of the social equation is actually understudied, right? But, when we have incredibly high real estate prices, whether that's for housing or for businesses, that that has lots of implications. Who can move to an area where the kind of quality of life and access to things like good schools for people that are living in a place. I came away from that thinking, boy, we should have a lot more people kind of studying the kind of construction and some of not just the regulatory issues around it, but the sort of the entire kind of building processes and how those influence what types of outcomes we're getting.
Yeah, no, that's well put. I mean, the built environment in general is the center of so much of the good progress we make on sustainability, as well as some of the big mistakes, and then we have to live with them for decades after that. And so that's an area where we're going to want to focus a great deal of attention. So thank you very much, audience at home. On behalf of my co-host, Milian, Olav Sorenson, and Stanford University, until next time. The Stanford Initiative on Business and Environmental Sustainability podcast series is sponsored by the Stanford Graduate School of Business and the Stanford Dorr School of Sustainability. Music by Charged Particles. That's Caleb Hutzler, Mike Rock, and John Krosnick.